So broadly, use cases are also similar to that. So we can come up with different type of use cases, and still everybody could be right. So there's nothing one or right or wrong answers. Right? Now, the fact that they have so many applications which are of similar nature but which are designed differently. Like you take up an email application, right? So there's so many email applications, and each one of them is different. Like you have Yahoo and you have Gmail, and they were completely different. So the basic behavior is the same. You still have to, check your emails and respond to emails and all. But the way they are designed or the way they look and all is different, right? So similarly, use cases also could be, different. So that doesn't mean that only one is right and the rest of them are all wrong. Okay. So having said that, let's see how these relationships would improve the use case diagrams. The first one is the generalization relationship. Okay, we tend to use the generalization where you have two or more use cases which has a significant common behavior. Right. So there are two, let's say, use cases which are talking about functionalities, two different functionalities, but a lot of them is similar. Right. So, for example, let's look at the example. You have a registration process. Right. Now there are some variations of registration. A local student can register in an office in a university. Right. A foreign student has to register in a university, and out-of-state student also has to register in a university. Right. But broadly, what are they doing? They're registering in the university. So, if there are some 10 or 6 steps in the registration process, a lot of them are common across these 3 use cases. In that situation, it doesn't make sense to repeat all 6 steps in 3 separate use cases. Okay, what we can do is we can create a common version of it and then create a parent use case. Okay, it has all the common steps, and then in the child use cases, you'll only specify the differences. Right? So you're not specifying all the details. So you would say, the primary flow for the parent use case would have these 6 steps. But for local registration, in primary flow, you would say step 1 to 5 refer to registration, and step 6 you list down. Right? Similarly, for foreign registration, you would say, step 1 to 3 refer to registration, and 4 to 8 you can list down in the child use case. Right? Out of state registration, first step 1 to 4 refer to the registration use case. Step 5 and 6 you can list down here. Okay, so that is how it will help you. Now the advantage of this is, let's say step 2 changes. So of this requirement, let's say the customer comes back and then say, I want this step 2 changed. You don't have to go and make the change at 3 places. So you don't have to make it here, here, and here. Right? So if you have used the generalization relationship, you will make the change only at 1 place at this point. Okay, so managing the changes would become much easier, and logically it makes sense. All the registration related steps are in one single use case, and then only the the deviations or the differences are covered in the child use cases, right? So it looks much more well organized, and it would also increase the maintainability, because any changes which comes in, it's easier to identify and make that change at one single place rather than in multiple places, right? So that would result in your reduction in effort as well. So if you have made change to this only one single one, right? So similarly, the design and development and testing effort would also be restricted to only this one single use case. You don't have to retest all these, redesign, redevelop, and retest all these 3 use cases. Okay, that's an advantage of a generalization. So you would use this symbol, a triangle, and then an arrow pointed out with a triangle as a head. Right? So this is the symbol which is signifying the generalization. So what this generalization means is, whatever is defined in the parent is by default applicable here for child use case. Over and above that, you can add some steps to this, or delete some steps from this, or modify some steps over here, right? So you can do all that. So you basically you can override the behavior. Okay. So that's what we are doing. We are defining 6 steps here, and step number 6 I'm changing in the local registration, and 4, 5, 6 I'm changing, and I'm adding 2 additional steps, 7 and 8. And then out of registration I'm just changing steps 5 and 6. Okay. So that way, at least the common steps are referred from the parent use case. The second one is an include use case. Okay. Now there would be some functionality which could repeat across different use cases. Right. Now, one way is like, let's say there are 4 different use cases. And let's say each one of them has 10 steps, 1 to 10 steps. I'm just keeping it simple. Each 4 of them has 10 steps. Okay. And some piece of functionality, let's call like steps 4 to 6 are common and they are repeating. 1, 2, 3, 4 places. This steps 4 to 6 are repeating. So rather than write those 4, 5, 6 here, 4, 5, 6 here, 4, 5, 6 here, and 4, 5, 6 here, 4 different places, you could pull it out and then create a separate use case for steps 4 to 6. Right? So some common behavior, if you have across unrelated use cases, you will pull that out and then include it. You're just saying that, this is a common behavior across 4 different use cases. So rather than explain it in all these 4, you're pulling it out and then creating a separate use case. And then you'll just include it. Okay. Now the advantage is that you have one single source again. Right? So this steps 4 to 6, you don't have to repeat at 4 different places. So if this one of these steps changes, either 4, 5, or 6 changes, you don't have to go and then make any changes at these 4 places. You just come and make change only at this place. Right? It increases your maintainability. Right? So your impacts are much lesser. Okay. Let's look at an example. I think it becomes much easier for you to understand. So we all use our online banking application, right? So our online banking system. We have bank accounts. We log in into the portal, and if you see, some of those transactions would have a secondary authentication, which means you'll have to authenticate yourself. So maybe the first time you log in, when you log in into the application, you would have to enter your user ID password. But sometimes you would also be asked to either enter a security code which is sent to your mobile number, or maybe you have a secondary password, or maybe you are asked to enter the some numbers at the grid values at the back of your card, right? So some secondary authentication mechanism is in place. Why? Because you want to add that extra layer of security. Okay. So let's say the process of secondary authentication is you will be send a security code to your mobile, right? And then you'll have to enter that into your online banking to confirm that transaction. So so the security code is sent, the customer would enter, and then the system would validate, and then proceed with the transaction. Right? So there are 3 steps. Right? Now, this secondary authentication is used at multiple places. So let's say when you want to transfer any funds, you have to enter that security code. Maybe whenever you are changing your password, then you'll have to enter that security code which is sent to your mobile. Whenever you want to add a new beneficiary, you want to implement that secondary authentication. So maybe if you are logging in from a new system also, right? So maybe if your IP address is new, right? So you might also still want to have that secondary authentication also, right? So there could be multiple places where you could do a secondary authentication. So broadly, that's the requirement. Okay. Now, if I have to explain these steps at each and every part, right, I have to again do it multiple times. Right, so I have to do it 3 times, 3 steps here, 3 steps here, 3 steps here, 3 steps here, and if there are 2 more use cases which are using this, I'll have to do that three here, right? Let's say this step 2 changes, or step 3 changes. Let's say one of these steps changes, right? I have to go and make changes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 requirements, 6 use cases are impacted, right? So it will implement. It means a lot of changes. Okay. So rather than do that, if I pull out these 3 steps and create a separate use case, calling as authentication of customer, then say a security code would be sent as step primary, step 1. Step 2, the user has to enter that code, and step 3, you will validate the code and confirm, and then proceed further. Right. So that's a authentication customer use case. Now I can just tag it along with all those features which need secondary authentication. So if I want to change password, I'll explain the steps to change password. So go to that page where the password change option is there. You enter your user ID, enter your old password, new password, and then confirm your new password. And then you click on the submit button. On submit button, you'll have to secondary authenticate. So you'll be sent a security code. You'll have to enter that value, and then only if it's validated, then you say that okay, password change successful. You display that message. Okay. So effectively, in your primary flow, you're removing these 3 steps and saying, refer to this authenticate customer use case for details about it. All right. So you have made your job a little more easier. So every time you want to use this feature, you just have to refer it in your use case.
Say like this authenticate customer, like whatever the use case is, it has like 3 requirements, like 3 steps, and like the change password uses these 3 steps, but the transfer funds uses only 2 steps. Then how we will mention like what has to be included in this and what has to be excluded?
So only where the functionality which includes all these 3 steps, then only you can pull it out. So ideally, you'll pull up some functionality.
Parent-child relationship will only work like if it works for everything.
So this would not be a parent-child. This is a include relationship. Parent-child is only for generalization.
Okay.
Right. And include is used where there is a common set of functionality, and that you want to use it at multiple use cases. You would pull that out and create a separate. So this use case doesn't have the common behavior, you cannot create an include use case. Right? So this whole steps, the 3 steps should be created in this include. Right? So if you cannot say that only 2 steps would be used in transfer funds, I would still include it. That won't work. Right? So logically look at it. Right? So if some common behavior is there. So let's say if only 2 steps are there, then you should bring out only 2 steps and then include it as a common behavior. You get it? So look at it from a functional point of view. Only when you say that okay, this behavior, I think authentication of customer is a common process which is across multiple use cases. So rather than repeat those steps at each and every use case, I'll pull it out and define it as a separate use case and include it wherever.
Can we say this like the first one? Can we say it's like a one-to-many relation, and this one is like many-to-one relation?
So you're talking about generalization, and
yeah, generalization is something about like one-to-many, and include is like many-to-one.
Could be, yes. So you're saying that there is a common one, and then that is leading to many use cases, and here many use cases are linking to one, right? Or a different way, if you have to put it in a different way, I would say, generalization. Let's say there is a use case, right? And let's say there are 2 use cases, and a significant part of that is common, right? Let's say 80% is common. So this 80% you'll define it as a parent use case, right? And usually if you look at the child, they're all related, right? So register, it's, one is local registration, foreign registration, out of registration, but the end of it, it's all registration, right? So they have something, a lot of the functionality common among themselves, right? So broadly, they're all registration process, right? But in an include, it's all unrelated features, right? Changing a password or funds transfer has nothing in common, except some minor thing, which would be 10% of the functionality, which is authenticating the customer. Get it? So there is nothing common between these, use cases which are including the common functionality. But in case of generalization, all the child use cases are related. So you tend to have a more or less common name, like registration in this case. Right? So you have registration for all these three processes, right? So I would say a common behavior, if it's a significant part of it is common behavior, like 70-80%, you will define a generalization. Let's say only a small part of the behavior is common. So you have multiple use cases, and let's say only this is common, right? Which is like 10%, right? So this 10% you will define as a use case, and then include it as required, right? So here, if 80% or 90% is common, right? So you will define that as a parent use case, right? Which is common, and then you would define the generalizations. So if a small piece of functionality is repeating across unrelated use cases, use and include. Okay, small piece of functionality like authentication of customer, small behavior is repeating across unrelated features, like changing password, you're authenticating customer, transferring of funds, you're authenticating customer, adding a beneficiary, you're authenticating customer, login from a new system, you're authenticating customer. All unrelated features, but you're using some common functionality. So pull that out and define it as an include. Okay, and where a significant part of that is common, like a local registration, foreign registration, and out of state registration. Let's say they have 6 steps or 6 screens, and out of that, more or less, most of them are common. Right, so close to 4 or 5 of them are common. Right, so 3, 4, 5, around 4 steps are common among these. Right. So why do you want to rewrite all those steps? All you can do is you can define a parent one, which is a common behavior, and then the child can have the specifics, the changes or modifications or new steps added onto the child cases. So the third type of relationship is extends. Okay. Now, when you're talking about some use case or some functionality, right? Now there would be a lot of those what if conditions. Right? So what if, under special conditions, some additional functionality could be relevant, right? Like, you have a common set of behavior, but under certain condition, you have some additional features coming in, right? So that additional behavior, which is relevant only in a particular scenario, we will capture that using extend relationship. Okay, so we'll clearly specify the reason. Under this condition, this additional steps would be defined as a separate use case. I'll explain this using a small example. Let's say I tell you to write a use case for receiving a phone call. Okay, so what you would generally write, you'll say now, okay, now when the phone should ring first, and then it should give a notification of who is calling first. Then you would accept the call. You click on that accept button or swipe, and then you would talk. And then once the call is over, you will end the call or disconnect. Okay, those are the steps involved in a phone call, right? But sometimes, maybe when you're already talking, you might receive a second call. So what options do you have? you can either place this call on hold and then take that call, or you can end this call and then take the additional call, or you can continue with the call and then ignore the other call as well, right? So, when I talk, when I ask you about, capturing the requirement about receiving a phone call, you will just capture the basic steps. You'll not say, in case an additional call comes in, then you'll have to do these things in this use case, right? So, because it will create a lot of confusion and a lot of unnecessary details in the core use case, right? My core requirement for receiving a phone call is, show the name of the person calling, give a ring notification, accept the call, talk, and disconnect, right? So these 4-5 steps are there. But in some special cases, under certain conditions, like when somebody else calls, you can take an additional phone call, right? So you can put it on hold and then take an additional phone call, or you could end a call and then continue with another call, right? But all that extended behavior is coming only in that some specific scenario where your current call has been where you're getting a second call when you're talking on the first call. You get it? You understand what extends mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So rather than put everything into the core base use case, you are creating those special conditions and special scenarios, and then saying that this is an extended behavior. It could be relevant only when you get a second call. Okay. Otherwise, normal behavior for receiving a phone call is captured in the base use case. So just to avoid that confusion and giving more clarity, you're saying that any additional special scenarios, any additional steps that needs to be done are covered. That primarily talks about the extents relationship, right? Again, try to figure out if you can, identify any relationships, or even if it's okay, you don't even identify any relationship. Don't forcefully try to create relationships or specifically, try to create out of it for no specific advantage, right? Only if they're coming out clearly, saying that okay, what, some behavior is repeating, create an include. If there is a lot of common behavior, go for a generalization, right? And then if some special conditions are there, then use an extents. Right? So that's how I would summarize usefully. So the way you would work is, you would the first step is define the use case diagram. Then, okay, I think I will talk about it later, once I introduce you to the rest of the UML diagrams and all. But broadly, when you are creating your use cases, the first step is you will create a use case diagram. Try not to identify the relationships at that point in time, because you don't actually understand the details about each use case individually, right? So you don't know what are the steps involved in local registration or foreign registration. So generally, first create the first draft of a use case diagram, and then start capturing the details about each of those use cases in your discussions. As and when you get more clarity, then you can figure out, what, there is common behavior which can authenticate customer, which I can pull it and use as include, or all these registration processes are actually the same, which is the registration, but with some minor tweaks. So I'll have a generalization relationship, right? Or this particular use case has some special scenarios, special conditions, and then it would have some additional extended steps, which is called as the extended behavior. So you use an extend. So your relationships would be updated as and when the requirement detail, you'll start writing that use case narrative and it becomes clear. Okay, I can pull this out and then create a separate use case. So that's where you'll go and update your use case diagram. So it's not like once you create a use case diagram, that's fine. So most of the time, you won't get the first final version of the use case diagram in the first attempt. It usually goes through some 2 or 3 iterations to arrive at that final use case diagram. Okay. As and when your clarity emerges on each of those functionalities, each of the use cases, you tend to identify the relationships also and make it more meaningful. Okay. Now, a lot of times what happens is you'll not get into a project which is starting right from the day one. Right? So it won't be a brand new project. So you'll be taken as a business analyst supporting some applications. So there would be some 3 or 4 existing applications. Then what the client would do is he would hire one business analyst and then say, any changes coming into the system, you will have to maintain that. So that would be your responsibility as a business analyst. So you're not actually having those the BRD, the RFP, and then you're creating a BRD out of it every time. Right? So only when a new project, you're working on a new project, then a BRD would be prepared. Otherwise, most of your requirements are captured using change request. Okay, so in that kind of situations, you don't really create a use case diagram there, right? So use case diagram would not be relevant because you're not having all the detailed requirements from scratch. Okay, all you'll have to do is there is an existing system, and you're expected to make changes to that existing system. Okay, so first you have to understand how the current feature or functionality is, and what is the change that the business user is suggesting, right? So all that you will capture as part of the description of change. Now this can be very elaborate. It will not be like 1-2 lines, right? So you could even actually add in those screenshots and they say, this is how your initial screen was. A lot of times what you do is, we have a system in place, right? So let's say there are some multiple screens in it. So let's keep it simple. There are only 4 screens, okay, or some 4 features and 4 screens each. Now the customer would come and then say, what, this requirement 2, it currently has only these 3 or 4 details, right? Now I want to capture some additional details, add in these 3 additional details here, right? So it would be as simple as that, right? So you have to capture all these details as part of the change request. So the customer would give you that these are the details, and then you'll have to elaborate it further. So you would say, this my current screen looks like this. So there are 4 details captured here, right? Now you have to add these additional 3 fields here, and so you'll exactly call that out, right? So maybe no. So you'd say this is the screen, current state, and then the future state has to be, right? So there would also be these 4 things. Then you are adding 3 additional fields into this, right? And make this as mandatory, right? And perform some checks like this should be a valid date format, and this should be a number, right? So all those details you will capture as part of the requirement. Okay, so effectively your requirement, the changes which are coming in are very simple, right? All you have to do is understand the current system, say that this is how the current state is now, the current screen looks like this, and this is the change that we need to make, and after change this is how the screen would look like. Very simple thing. You don't even need use cases or anything. It's just that you have to be very clear about the requirement. You have to ask all those right questions during the elicitation process and convert that screen to this screen, right? Typically, if you are hired into a support kind of projects, you'll be working on change request, and this is the only thing that you'll be doing, right? So you won't be creating those use case diagrams and getting into the complex things, right? It's quite simple that way. Okay, so the description of change would be captured here. Then you'll have to give a justification. Usually the SME would tell you why this change is required, what is the benefit you will get, right? And what all functionalities is related to, right? So if you have to figure out, does this have any impact on existing functionality, you have to clearly mention that, right? And what is the estimated time and cost to complete, okay? Is there any process change, any standard operating procedures have to be changed, any documentation or process changes have to be mentioned. All that you'll have to list down over here. Okay, Then you'll also give an estimation. So this would again, you might provide the analysis effort, and then the coding and development effort would be given by the architect, right? You will basically take the number of hours, you'll take the billing rate, and then finally get the dollar amount. Okay. So then finally you'll send it to the approval manager, right? So whoever is the SME or the project sponsor or the solution owner, they would take the decisions of whether it's approved or rejected, and they would specify the reasons, and finally it would be approved by the IT team and implemented. Right? So that is a process of a change request. Change requests are much simpler than your overall BRD. Okay, so all you have to do is you'll have to explain the change, what this is the current way it's working, and this is the future change that you'll have to make, or add in this additional feature into this particular screen. That is exactly what you'll have to do in a change request. Clear about this? So this is much simpler compared to the BRD process where you're doing end-to-end project. Okay, so a lot of times you'll just be managing this change request. There won't be any project planning phase, right? So there won't be any detailed project plan prepared and all, right? So you'll just be getting some minor change request, which will typically be in like 1 week or 2 weeks, or at the maximum months effort or time is required, right? Now the challenge is you'll have in your work is you'll have to understand the current state, how the application works. You have to understand the requirement, and then suggest how it would be looking in the future state. You have to identify the dependencies. If there are any other functionality depend on that, you'll have to list that down. Right? All that analysis has to be done by you, and then finally updated into the change request. So more or less, broadly the change request would be of the same format. Right? So you would have some additional details in most of the cases, like you'll capture the project name, the sponsor, right? Who has submitted the change request, who's the SME, when was it coming in, and what is the number, project manager, the ID, okay? Then what type of change it is, whether it's business change or which is because of some defect that you're trying to correct. Is it a new regulatory requirement which is coming in, right? What is the priority of it, right? So they will define it also. If it's critical, means this is definitely required. If this is not there, then you cannot use the system, right? So if it's high, means you definitely need it, but I can work with it until you develop and give it. Normal means I would want it maybe in the new release, next release, right? And low is like it's not impacting my work anyway, but I would want that feature, right? So the SME would give this classification. Then you will identify what are the benefits along with SME, right? And are there any alternatives or different ways in which you can meet this requirement, right? So sometimes there could be some two, three ways of implementing the solution, right? So you list down all those alternatives, right? And then you look at the impact of that change onto the overall system, right? And then what are all the other impacted functionalities, deliverables? Okay, you'll identify the cost, the schedule, how many additional days would be required, right? Who are the people who would require for this change? And overall, you list down the summary, and then finally, the change advisory board or change control board would take the decisions, right? So you'll have to get that authorization clearly, right? And then you'll keep track the change request. So ideally, when you start capturing the details, it will be in change request opened, and once it has been approved by the authorized board, you will be change it to approved, or if they reject it, you will change it to rejected, and once it's implemented, you will close it, right? Or if you have put it on hold and you wanted to review at a later date, you will finish, right? So broadly, the template would be more or less similar, right? So except for some additional details which would come in. If you look at it, more or less that would be the format of the change request. You have a description, then any additional documentation or screenshots, benefits, the advantages, disadvantages, what is the solution that we are providing, okay? What is the impact of that change, okay? And then you'll also identify the project cost and timelines, and then what is your recommendation, okay, and then what is the decision taken. All that would be captured as part of your in your change request. So team, are you clear now about how your requirements would be captured and how would generally be documented? So we still have to cover the BRD, what generally goes into a BRD and what are the details about that. So I'll cover about BRD in the next session, and we'll also spend some time on these rest of the UML diagrams, right? So class diagram, sequence diagram, and the rest of them. But it's not important. You can comfortably ignore those that session. It's not important to you. What is important is, how do you document your requirement? Primarily into a BRD using use case diagrams or change request, which I've just explained you. It's much simpler in a change request. You have to capture the current state and then what are the changes suggested and how does your future screens look like, right? And then you capture the business benefits, the cost, the timelines, and then the decision taken. All that would be captured as part of the CR, change request. Right? So tomorrow whole session we'll learn about non-functional requirements, what else goes into a BRD, right? So if you are involved in a full-fledged project, you tend to create a BRD. If you are just supporting an application, existing application, and taking up minor requests, those would come in as change request, right? So the change management process would kick in, and then you capture the requirements in that change request forms. So which would generally not be using the use case models. At the most, you would use those screenshots of how your screen would look like, and then maybe a process flow or a flow chart diagrams. All that would be used to explain the change request.
Who calculates or approves the cost for change request?
So see, analysis side, I mean, let's say, you'll have to analyze that requirement, understand the current system, and then design the future screens and all. So that part you might provide, right? So you'd say, no, I would require some 2-3 days to, understand the requirement and then, create these screens, right? So a lot of it you'll gain it through experience. You could give that estimate by looking at the requirement, high-level requirement, and understand. Based on your understanding of this existing application and the request coming in, you could decide that. Okay, and the development and design, development, and testing effort would be given by the technical architect. Okay, so you're not expected to identify the effort out of the development. So generally, or most of the times, what happens is the way the efforts are calculated is this way, right? So broadly, first the development and coding and unit testing effort is calculated. Okay, so there are some methods, estimation methodologies like function point analysis, simple, medium, complex. So there are multiple methodologies which are used to calculate the effort, right? So usually using these methods, you will calculate the development and unit testing effort. Okay, design, development, and unit testing. We call that as a D-cut effort. Design, coding, and unit testing. Okay. So that's a term which is generally used. So D-cut. And once you have that D-cut effort, so typically that would be around 40% of your effort. Right? Let's say this effort was around 40 days, right? So they would extrapolate it. 40 days is 40% of the effort. 100% of it would be 100 days. So the overall timelines would be 100 days, and requirement would be around 25% or 20 to 25%, depending on the complexity of the requirement. Similarly, testing also would be around 30 to 35%, and finally, all your implementation and request handling and all that would take around 5%. So this is how broadly the efforts are distributed. So sometimes you will not be able, you're not expected to give the requirement related effort also. right? So they would extrapolate it from the decut effort which has been identified by using some of these methodologies. Okay, so it will be given that, okay, now since the development takes 40 days, you could capture the requirement in 20-25 days. That is the logic which is used. Meet again tomorrow, and tomorrow's session we'll discuss about the business requirements document or BRD. How is the typical BRD structured? What are details we're capturing that? We'll look at it. Okay, so yeah, so let me recap. We learned about use case relationships today. We learned about the change request and how do we capture the request, change request coming in, right? So be clear with these two topics. I just want to make sure that you understand the topics what we cover daily and are well prepared for those topics. I think whatever is important, I'll point it out. So be clear about those overall use case overview. I'll ask questions about what is a use case, and then we'll have to explain use case diagram, use case description, right? And even to an extent relationships. Okay, and then you also have to be very clear about the change request. How would you handle a change request? What all details are covered in a change request?